Welcome to World History. Today we're going to return to a survey across Asia and some of the rest of the world and look at the effects of all of these European states that are changing so rapidly as they start expanding out, looking for new markets, new resources, and eventually dominating most of the rest of the world. So today we're going to return to South Asia for the first time since Unit 2 and check in on our old friend, the Mughal Empire, and see how they're doing. Here are your objectives for today. Not to spoil it too much, but we're going to look at why the Mughal Empire declined. We're going to look at the costs and benefits of company rule for people in South Asia. And we're going to analyze the cause and effects of the Sepoy Revolt. So let's kick our story off. As you hopefully remember, the Mughal Empire is the Muslim empire that dominated most of the Indian subcontinent, starting in the 1500s and ruling all the way into the 1800s. Mughal rulers had a number of different challenges. I mean, obviously, South Asian people are very diverse, and as the Mughals were primarily Muslim and they were ruling over a Hindu minority or majority, they had some significant challenges as far as incorporating them in. People like Akbar, of course, tried to come up with his universal religion and were more tolerant of Muslims, but Alamgir and especially Aurangzeb, some of his successors, were much less so, and this is going to lead to the significant revolts and the Mughal Empire weakening substantially over time. Really, in the end, the rule of Aurangzeb is one of the things that sort of ended up bringing down the Mughal Empire. As you hopefully remember, he embarked on this massive tomb building project, creating the glorious Taj Mahal as a tomb for his wife. And not that the Taj Mahal isn't super nice, but if you want to talk about like useful things you can spend your people's money on, you've got like infrastructure projects and building up a military somewhere near the top, and then you've got tombs, just above, like just dumping money into the ground. Because although eventually the Taj Mahal is going to be somewhat beneficial for tourism, during its time it's not. It costs a significant amount of money, leads to raised taxes, and doesn't really accomplish anything. Because of this, over time, Mughal rulers had to allow more and more foreign trade in order to try to offset these expensive costs, and of course the costs of putting down rebellions, because putting down rebellions costs a lot of blood and treasure. And so they would allow more and more foreign traders in so they could tax the trade in order to try to make more money. This led to the rise of a series of East India companies. These were corporations from Europe, joint stock companies with investors giving money in order to finance these overseas voyages. Originally, the Dutch were the primary East India company, trading all throughout the Indian Ocean, sort of in that trade network. But eventually, they're going to be displaced by the British after a series of mercantilist wars, somewhat, similar to the 7 Years' War, that we haven't really talked about, but just know that they start getting displaced. Over time, these companies, especially the British East India Company, are going to set up trading posts and expand inward, slowly taking more Indian territory and finding Indian rulers who are willing to work with the company and allow them to expand. The major conflict that decided that the British would dominate India as opposed to the French or another rising European power was known as the Carnatic Wars. It's one of the theaters of the 7 Years' War. You might remember this as the one where it's sort of Prussia's coming out party on the world stage in Central Europe. England gets the entire East, all of the France's North American colonies, and at the climatic Battle of Plassey, a British-aligned Indian army is able to defeat a French-aligned Indian army, and Sir Robert Clive becomes the undisputed ruler of a significant portion of India by building these coalitions through local rulers. This is something called indirect rule, where you find sort of Indian rulers who are willing to work with the British East India Company. And in exchange for fabulous amounts of wealth, they allow the company to come in and trade and have some control over policy. This ushers in a phase called company rule, in which the East India Company more or less takes over all of India. The East India Company is, of course, a publicly traded corporation, and so you've got these, they send these governors over to rule, and power is kept through the use of Indian soldiers known as sepoys. In exchange for a decent salary, these sepoys then basically carry out the East India Company's will and ensure that they can control a significant portion of India. And so they're able to get access to things like indigo, coffee, cotton, stuff like that, opium, all those sort of things. India does get some benefits from company rule. Obviously, trade with the British Empire and access to more advanced European trade goods is certainly a benefit. And they do get some infrastructure, specifically railways. Although these railways are generally designed to get resources out of India as opposed to helping Indians move around, some railroads are generally better than no railroads, so that's a benefit. But there are some pretty substantial costs. The company generally pushed Indians into forming more cash crops and fewer sort of crops for consumption. This eventually led to the Bengali famine, which might have killed about a third of the population of this sort of East Indian province, somewhere in the area of 10 to 15 million people. And the company did absolutely nothing to alleviate the famine. In fact, they continued to export food even as tons of people in India starved to death. The famine is an extreme example of the general racism of British company rule and imperialism in general, with British subjects generally being elevated over the native sort of Indian population. And although working for the British generally got you better wages than you would have gotten otherwise, most Indians were sort of limited to menial jobs and had very little opportunity for advancement. Over time, of course, Indians began to resent British rule, and we started seeing rising opposition, especially as the British, as all companies do, try to cut costs. They cut the wages of sepoys multiple times, and many formerly elite Indians really resent having these British come in and basically lock them out of the government of their own country. All of this leads to a massive revolt called the Sepoy Revolt or the Sepoy Mutiny. The sepoys were obviously these Indian soldiers, and they had been growing more and more discontented for a while. Finally, news got out that the British had been using these cartridges for the guns. You had to bite off these powder cartridges in order to load the guns. And these cartridges had been greased with animal fat, which was profoundly offensive to both Hindus, who in general are vegetarian, and Muslims, who in general don't eat pork. So both the Muslim and the Hindu subjects were outraged. They rose up and forced the East India Company out. But then the British Army came in with their advanced weaponry and were able to crush the sepoys at huge cost of human life. So here's the British lion getting revenge on the Bengal tiger. And the British government directly takes over India. So no more Mughal or company rule. Now the British government takes over India in what's called the Raj. India is incorporated into the British Empire, and they create this branch of the British government known as the Indian Civil Service, which helps to facilitate, it's like a bureaucracy to help facilitate the ruling of India. So the Indian Civil Service was open to anyone, but you had to pass a test in London, England, in English in order to serve in this Indian Civil Service. So only the most elite of the elite of Indian families could afford to educate their children and send them to England to take the test. There, of course, were some Indians who were able to go and take this test and were able to rise in the sort of British government, but it was very rare, and for the most part, Indians were locked out of this whole process. Opposition to British rule really started to unite the Indian people, which before this time period were very, very they were very diverse and didn't really see themselves as one group of people. And so ironically, opposition to and mistreatment by the British really created a sense of Indianness in the diverse South Asian population. And it's going to lead to a push to expel the British and create a new country called India that actually represents its people. So this brings us back to our objectives. Hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail. And when we come back, we're going to move over to China and look at the effects of European trade and contact there.